All right, so let's talk about UI or user interface unit testing. Right? Some of the concepts that we'll cover here are not necessarily specific to user interface testing. They apply to unit testing in general, but some of what we're going to cover here are is specific to the user interface. Right? So let's consider user interfaces when we want to test them individually. As the name suggests, that says unit testing means that we want to be able to treat them individually, outside of any influence that there might be from other components that might be part of the application. These components, these user interface components, don't exist in a vacuum. Right? They have other dependencies with other things in the application. They might depend on a remote database that they have to access, some remote API they need to hit, right, to retrieve the data. They might have if you have frameworks such as Angular or React, they might have services that are also implemented on the client side that might be being injected into the component. They also depend on the browser itself, right? Having to parse the HTML, having to run the model view controller framework inside the browser, rendering and generating a DOM, right? All sorts of dependencies that we want to be able to address them individually. We also have a dependency of the user, interacting with these components, right? Users generating events as they click, as they drag, as they type in the keyboard. They generate all these events that make the behavior the behavior of the component depends on this interaction. So we want to make sure that we have control over all those pieces, right? That we can put the component in a known state, right? That we know that if it's in one particular state and it's prodded or it's and if it has a particular event, we know that it should behave in a particular way, right? If it doesn't, we want to make sure that it's because we know what the controlled environment is. Right? We want to be able to control the environment where we do the testing, right? And just remove all other dependencies. So let's talk about the various techniques that we can use to isolate components. How is it that we isolate the components from all these other dependencies so that we can make sure that it is running, we are testing it in a known environment? So let's take a look at the components that we have been implementing so far. The types of components, at least the React components that we've been implementing so far, they often are referred to as stateful components. Right? They're components that maintain their own state. Right? They have their own local variables, and as folks interact with the component, as they click, as they drag, right, the component reacts by updating its own state. Yes, it also has dependencies with a remote source, data source. Right, it needs to go out and fetch data from somewhere else in the system, presumably through a RESTful web service, right, and then retrieve this data and then update its own local state and re-render the component, right? And because it's designed this way, that it has its own local state, that it's handling its own state, right? Its own events, right? That it needs to go out and fetch this data from a remote system, makes it very, very hard to test all by itself, okay? Because it has all these other dependencies and it has this internal state. Ideally, the whatever it is that we're testing would be just a simple function, right? That we know that if we feed it, if it's doing a simple add, right? We know that 2 + 2 is always going to be 4, okay? Whereas if we're testing an account system, or where you can withdraw and deposit, right? That we're not if we deposit $100. We don't, and then we want to test the balance, right? Well, the balance is going to depend on whatever the initial balance was there, right? The original state of the account is, yes? So that complicates matter, that we need to set up the state in a particular way so that if we know a particular input, we know what the output should be, right? If instead it's functional, that whatever data you feed it, you know that it's always going to be the same response. It just simplifies the testing so much more. So what we'd like to be able to do here is that all our components should be as stateless as possible. We want to remove this dependency on the this.state. We want to remove that. Also, the handlers are there so that as folks click and drag and type and do as they interact with the application, it handles its own events, right, and then it updates its own state. Right? So the event handlers are kind of go hand in hand with the state, right? And the other dependency is that its data really resides or depends on data that lives elsewhere or in a remote site. So it depends on HTTP access, right? It has to make sure that this other remote service is running. Right? So we would like to be able to mock that as much as possible, right? We want to remove that dependency and have control over that. So the current design is lacking in many of these respects, right? So we're going to refactor a lot of these components to convert them so that they are testable, right? They're friendly, they're test friendly, right? Right now they're not test friendly. Okay, so one of the things that we could do is to move some of what it is that we want to test. We want to move the dependencies elsewhere. We want to say, well, we want to apply what a design principle called is a separation of concerns, right? Where whenever you look at any applications, there are many different types of concerns, right? You want the application to look pretty. Well, that's one concern. We want the data to be accessible remotely. That's another concern. We want to be able to handle events as the user interacts. That's another concern. And we can typically put all these concerns in different buckets, right? In different challenges of how to address all these different concerns. And usually these concerns become so complex, the challenges are so complex, right, that perhaps they should be addressed by entirely different type of set of skills. Well, if you want the application to look pretty, usually you give it out to somebody who knows about design, right, and they know about all CSS and they know how to style it and make it look professional. It's something so specialized, right, that there's a whole industry, addressing this particular challenge, right? So what we like to be able to do is identify what are all the different challenges when you're developing an application, right? And see if we can separate what the concerns are, right? So, for instance, oftentimes the way we represent data is not necessarily the way we render the data, right? Oftentimes, when you render the data, you have the concern of who your audience is. All right? If the audience is an administrator, well, then you can get away with pumping a lot of data for this super user, right? Creating lots and lots of really long lists and filling the screen with tons and tons of data. If this is someone who's a casual user, the same exact data, you might decide that you want to have a wizard where you show some information in one page and then a little bit of information in the next page and so on and so forth. Make sense? So again, depending on the concern has different challenges. So same thing here. When we're rendering in a component, right, we have certain concerns. One of them is, how do we manage state? The application needs to maintain some state, right? Now the challenge is that the application usually has lots and lots of different components, and it would be very complex if every component would have to maintain its own state, right? Typically, you would have to start the state at some top level parent component, then that feeds all that state to all the subcomponents, right, so that they can render themselves, right? So there's we haven't had the chance to play around with this perhaps in a web development course, but typically we address this with using techniques that specifically target this particular challenge of maintaining state, right? And there's whole tools designed for addressing these issues. If you've had the chance to play around with Redux, in particular for React, you might know what I'm talking about, of how complex it is to maintain state in an application, in a web application. So certainly we want to, we want to rip out, right, any challenges that we might be addressing at when we are rendering any data, right? So here we are separating the concerns of maintaining state and the rendering of that state. Right? So we're saying the state, the component is no longer going to be responsible for handling its own state. It's not going to be responsible for handling any of its own events. Right? Instead, someone is going to feed it the state. Someone's going to say, hey, this is your state, and the only responsibility you're going to have is to render it. Right? You're just going to display it. Right? It won't be your responsibility to know, right, what is your current state, because it will be given to you. Right? Basically, what we're trying to do is go to a functional model. Right? Not a stateful model. It's a function that if I give you 2 plus 2, it's always going to be 4. Right? So that we can simplify how do we test this, right? So that there are no complexity on how to test this. So we're going to rip out the concern of managing state from our component, and we're going to delegate it to someone else, someone who's going to be responsible for maintaining state. Right? We're going to separate those concerns. Also, we're going to rip out any dependencies of where does this data come from. Right? This data comes from some server, right, or some network, or and so we're going to rip out any concerns of how this data ever got to me. Right? So again, we're going to rip that out, and the only thing we're going to leave inside of this component is that it's only going to render. That's all it's going to do. Right? All the data is going to be fed into it. Right? All the events are going to be delegated. Notice that the events are going to flow from the component, right, to someone who is responsible for managing all those events, right, updating the state, and then sending it back to the component for rendering. So our components are going to become very dumb, right? Very, very simple, so that the only thing that they ever do is render. Make sense? Also, the RESTful services, we'll come back to it in a minute, but they too are going to be designed in such a way that they can be fed into the whoever needs this, right? As opposed to maintaining its own instance of a service. If you remember, when most of the stateful components that we've been looking at so far, right? We've been grabbing a hold of the instance, right, of these services, right? We're going to design it in such a way that it's not going to be its responsibility to fetching the service or grabbing a hold of the service. Instead, someone's going to feed it what the service is. What that's going to allow us to do is that later on is going to be able to allow us to make it very easy for us to mock that service, right, and then send it as an argument, right, inject it as an argument, so that the container, right, and the component, right, will be using whatever service you feed it. Right, so that instead of using the actual service that actually goes out to a RESTful service, instead it will use whatever service we feed it, so that it will be using ours that doesn't necessarily go out to a network, so that we can sever that dependency of having going out to the network. Okay, all right. So to point this, just to reiterate, right, we're going to go from a stateful React component to a stateless React component. Okay, from a component that is aware of its state, that it is responsible for managing its own state. We're going to go to a stateless model, right, where it is not responsible for maintaining its own state, right, and not responsible for handling its own events. All right, and this is a concept that is that is not necessarily just for user interface. Same thing if you were implementing things in the on the server in Java, right? You want to isolate and things be fed into our components so that they don't have any direct dependency on any other component that is out there. You want to create them so that they're loosely coupled, right? Not strongly coupled, right? So that you can take them apart, right? And just test them individually. Right. Yeah. So this is the next thing that I was mentioning, that the service. So what's going to allow us to do is that because the service is going to be implemented in such a way that we're going to be able to replace it with a mock version of that service, right, and feed it into our container so that we can mock the service, we can mock the state, right, and so that any events that the stateless component generates, we can generate a mock version of the state and then render it so that we can verify that for this particular event and this particular state we have an expected DOM rendering, and we can compare that against what the actual. We can compare the actual rendering against what the expected rendering would be. Right? We can say, oh yeah, it renders correctly. Right? For this event, for this state, it should render that. And if it renders it correctly, then it's good. Right? Our component is not broken. Make sense? Right. All right. So let's take a look at a component that we worked on a while back, and let's see how we can go from how we can refactor this component. For instance, if you remember, we were playing around with a quotes component a while back. It was stateful, right? In the sense that it had a constructor. It maintained its own instance for the local state, where it declared a couple of state variables such as quotes, and I think there was another quote in there somewhere. It also had a dependency on the service, right? It had a dependency on the quote service, which got hold of using a singleton pattern, right? It got a hold of an instance, and then it maintained it as a local variable. Okay, it was a common implementation of a stateful component. Internally, it also declared several event handlers, right? So that if you updated some data, then it went out to the server and updated the data, right? It allowed you to remove quotes, update quotes, create brand new quotes, and you probably have something similar for implementation for your own assignments, right? Whether you were implementing a list component, or you were implementing a summary component, right? A summary or a details component, yes? And you would have similar event handlers implemented as well. And so and then there was the section where we were rendering the actual content, which I'm not going to go into the details, but typically that iterated over the list of quotes, right? And had all the buttons and had all the links that allowed you to update. So what we'd like to be able to do is to remove all that, remove all those dependencies, and instead, right, what we're going to do is that we're going to replace that implementation with a purely functional implementation. Right? It's just going to be a function, literally just a function. Right? Here's the declaration of the function. The function is called quotes. It takes as arguments. Here's the parameter. Here's a list of parameters, right? And here's the declaration of the function. Right? And the function just returns HTML. That's all it does. Right? It has no event handlers in here, no state maintenance. There's no access to any services. Right? It purely depends on somebody feeding it everything. The state, here it is, quotes and quote. Right? This is a state that somebody's going to call. It's going to instantiate this function. It's going to pass it the state. Internally, the HTML will iterate over those quotes. It'll do the same rendering. Right? It'll do identically the same rendering. Okay? But instead of using the local state, it will use whatever is passed in as an argument. Make sense? Right? Same thing for the event handlers. Instead of handling all the events here internally in the stateless component, what we'll do is that we're going to bind all the events here, the on clicks, the on change, all those. Instead of having the declaration of these functions here, we're just going to point them to these functions that are being passed to us as references. We're going to say that if there's an on-click on some delete button, we're going to call the delete quote. Right? If there's a click on a create brand new quote, we're going to bind that on-click to the create quote event handler is here. But we're not implementing it. Someone is injecting it to us. Make sense? Right? What this is going to allow us to do, this is going to allow us to test the rendering all by itself, right? Because now we have control of what we can pass it. We can pass it a very well-known list of quotes, right? We can pass it an implementation of create quote that we want, right? Not the actual implementation, that actually adds a quote, but it's a test function that we can pass in and see if it behaves correctly, right? If it renders it correctly. And so the only thing that's going to stay here, that's going to look identical to what we had originally, is just the rendering of the content. That's going to stay identical to what we have. So this is going to be the only concern for this component, the rendering. Yes? Right? Everything else is loosely coupled because being passed as an argument. Whatever the actual implementation, whatever the actual state, it is not our business. Right? We just notify you. Okay? For the service, it's going to be something similar. Right? Here we have the container. This is going to be a brand new component that is going to house the actual concerns of maintaining state. Right? So here, this container is going to have the responsibility of maintaining state. It is going to be its only responsibility. It doesn't know how this is rendered. Right? It doesn't care where the data goes or where the data comes from. Right? Its only responsibility is to manage state. Right? That's its only responsibility. Notice here that basically what we did is that we moved all the implementation of the maintaining the state into our component here. We moved all the event handlers are also living in this container. But also notice here that the service, we're not getting a hold of the instance of that service like we normally do, right? Getting the get instance from the singleton, right? Instead, it's being passed to us as a property. If somebody is passing us the service, this is also a means of decoupling, right? The state management where the data actually exists. The data exists in the service, where the service communicates with the server, it goes and fetches the data, it updates the data, it deletes the data, it does all data management, right? But this component, that's not its business of how that actually happens, right? So we're being passed as an argument, we're being passed a reference to the actual service to be used. What that's going to allow us to do is that to test this component, we're going to be able to feed it whatever service implementation we want for testing, right? And then we can test whether the state management works all by itself, right? If we have one quote and we create a brand new quote, did it add the correct quote? Right? Did it remove the correct quote? Did it update the correct quote? We can test the state management all by itself. So this is going to allow us to feed the service at test time, right? And notice that the dependencies that what it renders is that basically it calls quotes and then passes quote, right, passes the state of the quotes down to the actually rendering of the element quotes. All the event handlers are now living in here, right? We've moved them from the stateful quote list, right? We've moved it from there, which is now stateless. We've moved it, and now they live here. And what we do is that we pass them down as arguments. We pass them down to the quotes. We pass the state. We pass all the event handlers. Right? We pass them down to the component, so that whenever that component clicks and drags and types, is going to come back here, right? Notify all the event handlers that live in this container. Make sense? All right.